Imagine this. You wake up one morning, not to an alarm, but to silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something finally being still. You look around at your life, the schedules stacked on top of schedules, the subscriptions you don't remember signing up for, the group chats pulsing with noise, the inbox that refills the moment you empty it. And somewhere beneath the hum of it all, beneath the performance of productivity and the theater of progress, a question rises through the noise like smoke through still water. What is all of this for? Not in a nihilistic sense, not the question of someone giving up, but the question of someone waking up. The question of a person who has been running so fast for so long that they've never stopped to ask whether the road they're sprinting down actually leads anywhere they want to go. Today, we begin a journey into an idea that is both ancient and radically relevant: the intelligence of simplicity. This is not about poverty, denial, or retreating from the world. It is about wisdom, intention, and freedom. And by the end of this journey, the final insight will be the most powerful of all, one that can permanently change how you understand success, happiness, and yourself. The reflections of Henry David Thoreau speak directly to a modern soul that feels overwhelmed, distracted, and exhausted. While technology accelerates life and society celebrates excess, Thoreau quietly asks a dangerous question. What if less is not a loss, but a gain? What if simplicity is not weakness, but the highest form of intelligence? This is for those who feel that something essential has been lost beneath constant consumption, comparison, and speed. It is for those who sense that life should feel deeper, calmer, and more meaningful than it often does. Before we go deeper, if this already resonates with something in you, take a moment to support this channel. Subscribe, leave a like, share this with someone who feels overwhelmed by modern life, and drop your thoughts in the comments as we go. What you are about to hear may challenge beliefs you have carried for years, and the realizations ahead have the power to reshape how you see the world and your place within it. Thoreau did not write from theory alone. He lived his philosophy. When he retreated to Walden Pond, he was not escaping society. He was studying it from a distance, with clear eyes and an uncluttered mind. Now hold that feeling from the opening. Don't dismiss it. Don't scroll past it. Because that discomfort, that quiet creeping sense that something essential has been traded away for something hollow, is not weakness. It is one of the most intelligent signals your mind has ever sent you. And almost everything in your life has been designed to make sure you never hear it. Here is the paradox that very few people are willing to stare at directly. We live in the most abundant era in human history. More wealth, more information, more options, more convenience than any civilization before us could have imagined, and yet anxiety is at record levels. Depression is rising. Loneliness has become epidemic. People with every material comfort report feeling, in their most honest moments, profoundly lost. We have more than enough of everything, and yet the feeling of enough has never been harder to find. How is that possible? We were told with great conviction that more was the answer. More success, more achievement, more accumulation, more speed. We built entire identities around the relentless pursuit of it. We structured our days, our relationships, our self-worth around a single organizing principle. Keep moving forward, keep acquiring, keep becoming more. And we called this intelligence. We called this ambition. We called this being alive. But consider what was quietly happening underneath all that motion. Your attention, the single most finite and irreplaceable resource you possess, was being carved up and sold in fragments. Your desires were being engineered by systems that profit directly from your dissatisfaction. Your sense of identity became inseparable from what you owned, what you achieved, what you could display. And the deeper you went into that world, the harder it became to find the part of yourself that existed before any of it. Ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you sat with your own thoughts without reaching for a device? When did you last feel genuinely present? Not entertained, not distracted, not optimizing, but simply and completely here. When did you last make a decision about your time, your energy, your attention, that wasn't in some way shaped by comparison, expectation, or the invisible pressure of a world that never stops demanding more? These are not comfortable questions. They are not supposed to be. Thoreau wrote that the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. He was not being cruel. He was being precise. He was describing something he observed not in the destitute or the downtrodden, but in the ordinary, striving, well-meaning person who has accepted, without ever quite examining, a set of assumptions about what makes a life worth living. What if those assumptions are wrong? What if the pursuit of complexity is not the path to freedom, but the very thing standing in its way? What if the mind doesn't flourish in abundance, but in clarity? What if the smartest choice you can make in this moment, in this life, in this relentless, accelerating, overstimulated world, is also the one that looks from the outside like the least impressive? What if the answer isn't more? This question is about to unravel something, because the problem isn't simply that we've been busy. The problem runs deeper, far deeper into the psychology of who we've been taught to be, and the invisible forces that shaped us into people who can no longer sit still enough to ask whether any of it was ever our own choice.
So why does this happen? If the trap is so visible, if the exhaustion is so universal, if the quiet desperation Thoreau described nearly 2 centuries ago is still echoing in the chests of millions of people today, then why do we keep walking into it? Why, generation after generation, culture after culture, do intelligent, capable, deeply feeling human beings surrender their time, their attention, and ultimately their lives to a way of living they never consciously chose? The answer is not laziness. It is not weakness. It is something far more unsettling. It is that the trap was built specifically for you. Carl Jung, one of the most penetrating psychologists of the modern era, spent his life mapping the hidden architecture of the human mind, and what he found again and again was this: most people do not live their own lives. They live a life assembled from the outside, from parental expectations, cultural scripts, social hierarchies, and inherited definitions of success. And they carry this borrowed existence so long that they eventually mistake it for themselves. Jung called the mask we wear to meet the world's demands the persona, and he warned with striking urgency that a life lived entirely through the persona, entirely in performance, entirely in response to external pressure, leads not to fulfillment, but to a slow and silent inner collapse. This is not a metaphor. It is a psychological process playing out in real time, in real lives, right now. From the moment you were old enough to understand reward and punishment, you were being shaped, not maliciously in most cases, but systematically. You were taught that stillness was laziness, that simplicity was settling, that the person who accumulates more, achieves more, displays more, is worth more. These lessons didn't arrive as lectures. They arrived as atmosphere, in the way adults spoke about money, in the anxiety that surrounded scarcity, in the subtle but unmistakable message that your value was conditional on your output. And so you learned to produce, to perform, to fill every silence with activity, every space with acquisition, every moment of uncertainty with consumption. You learned, in other words, to be busy, because busyness felt like safety, and safety was the closest thing to peace you were ever shown. Viktor Frankl, who survived the annihilation of the Nazi concentration camps and emerged with a philosophy forged in the most extreme human suffering imaginable, argued that the deepest need of the human being is not pleasure, not power, but meaning. And meaning, he insisted, cannot be bought, inherited, or performed. It can only be discovered in stillness, in honest self-examination, in a life deliberately aligned with one's deepest values. But here is the quiet catastrophe. A complex life makes meaning nearly impossible to find. When every hour is scheduled, every thought interrupted, every quiet moment filled with the ambient noise of notifications and obligations and manufactured urgency, the inner voice that carries meaning cannot be heard. It is not that the voice disappears, it is that the noise drowns it. And over time, you stop listening. You stop expecting to hear anything. You begin to believe that the noise is the substance of life, and that the longing you feel underneath it is simply a character flaw to be managed, medicated, or scrolled away. Friedrich Nietzsche saw the seeds of this centuries before the smartphone existed. He warned about what he called the herd mentality, the tendency of human beings to abandon their individual will and authentic self in exchange for the comfort of conformity, to follow not because the path is true, but because everyone else is following it, and deviation feels too dangerous, too lonely, too strange. The modern world has perfected this mechanism. It has made conformity feel like freedom by offering an infinite menu of options, all of which lead, curiously, to the same destination: distraction, dependency, and the dull ache of a life half-lived. Arthur Schopenhauer, darker and more unflinching still, argued that human desire is by its very nature insatiable, that the moment one want is satisfied, another rises to take its place, not because you are broken, but because desire, untrained and undirected, is simply the mind's default setting. The only escape, he believed, was not to acquire more skillfully, but to want less deliberately, to cultivate a relationship with sufficiency so deep and so intentional that the endless machinery of craving simply loses its power over you. Thoreau understood this intuitively, viscerally, in his bones. He saw that the person who never examines what they want, who simply absorbs desire from the culture around them and spends their life chasing it, is not free. They are a vessel, a beautifully decorated, frantically busy, quietly desperate vessel. And the tragedy is not that they suffer. The tragedy is that they suffer without knowing why. Neuroscience has since confirmed what these philosophers intuited. Chronic overstimulation, the condition most of us now live in permanently, fragments the prefrontal cortex's capacity for deep, deliberate thought. It shortens attention span, elevates cortisol, and trains the brain to expect and demand constant novelty. In other words, the more complex and stimulating your environment becomes, the less capable your mind becomes of the one thing that actually produces wisdom: sustained, focused, uninterrupted reflection. Simplicity is not a retreat from intelligence. It is the very condition that intelligence requires. And yet we resist it, fiercely, instinctively, as though something in us knows that if we slow down long enough, if we strip away enough of the noise, we will be forced to confront a question we have been outrunning for years. Who am I when there is nothing left to perform? That question is not the end of something. It is, as Thoreau discovered at Walden Pond, the very beginning. But before you can answer it, before you can even begin to hear it clearly, you must first understand how deeply and how invisibly the complexity you've accepted has already shaped the person you believe yourself to be. Because the consequences of this hidden problem are not abstract. They are written into your body, your relationships, your choices, and the strange, persistent feeling that despite everything you've built, something essential is still missing. That is where we are going next.
You don't notice it happening. That is precisely what makes it so devastating. It doesn't arrive as a dramatic collapse. It doesn't announce itself with sirens or symptoms you can point to on a chart. It seeps in slowly, the way water finds its way through the smallest crack in a foundation, patient, invisible, and quietly catastrophic. One day you realize you cannot remember the last time you felt genuinely rested, not physically rested,
spiritually rested. The last time your mind was still enough to simply receive the moment you were standing in, without immediately processing it, categorizing it, or reaching past it toward the next thing. That absence, that hollow where presence used to live, is not accidental. It is the accumulated consequence of a life built on complexity, and it is costing you more than you have been told. Consider what happens to the brain under conditions of chronic overstimulation. Neuroscientists studying the effects of information overload have found that the constant fragmentation of attention does not merely make us distracted, it structurally rewires the brain's reward circuitry. Every notification, every scroll, every ping of incoming information triggers a small release of dopamine, the brain's anticipation chemical. Over time, the brain begins to crave this fragmentation. Stillness stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling threatening. Silence stops feeling restorative and starts feeling unbearable. You reach for your phone not because you want to, but because the absence of stimulation has become neurologically uncomfortable. Thoreau saw the embryo of this pattern long before neuroscience gave it a name. He observed that people in his time were already becoming servants to their own complexity, working longer hours not to live better, but to maintain the expanding machinery of a life built on want. He wrote of men who had no time to be anything but machines. Imagine what he would say about a world where the machine fits in your pocket and follows you to bed. But the neurological cost is only the surface layer. Beneath it, something more personal and more painful is taking shape. Psychologists studying the relationship between materialism and well-being have produced findings that are as consistent as they are uncomfortable. Individuals who anchor their sense of worth in external achievement, in status, accumulation, and the perception of others, experience significantly higher rates of anxiety, depression, and existential emptiness than those who orient their identity around intrinsic values. This is not a marginal finding. It replicates across cultures, age groups, and income levels. The more tightly your identity is woven into what you have and how you appear, the more fragile and fearful that identity becomes. And here is where the trap closes completely. The very systems profiting from your complexity understand this psychology better than you do. The modern attention economy is not a neutral marketplace. It is an architecture of engineered dissatisfaction, designed with extraordinary precision to keep you perpetually feeling that you are one purchase, one achievement, one upgrade away from the version of yourself that is finally enough. Every algorithm studying your behavior, every advertisement calibrated to your insecurities, every social platform built on the principle of infinite comparison, all of it is optimized for a single outcome, to ensure you never arrive, to ensure the horizon keeps moving, to ensure that the feeling of enough remains permanently just out of reach. Thoreau recognized this inversion with startling clarity. He observed that most people do not own their possessions own them, that the accumulation of things creates not freedom, but obligation. Every object requires maintenance, insurance, storage, attention. Every status symbol demands defense. Every layer of complexity added to a life adds a corresponding layer of anxiety, a new surface area for fear to colonize. The Stoic philosopher Seneca, writing 2,000 years before the age of social media, warned with almost eerie prescience that wealth beyond necessity does not reduce anxiety, it amplifies it. Because the more you have to lose, and the more you have to lose, the more of your precious, irreplaceable mental energy is consumed not by living, but by protecting. Consider how this plays out in the texture of an ordinary day. You wake already behind. The The mental load begins before your feet touch the floor. The obligations, the comparisons, the low-grade performance anxiety that hums under every interaction. You move through your hours not in a state of engagement, but in a state of management. Managing appearances, managing expectations, managing the gap between who you are and who you believe you need to become. And at the end of the day, when the noise finally quiets, instead of feeling the satisfaction of a life genuinely lived, you feel something closer to depletion, a vague, sourceless exhaustion that sleep doesn't fully cure. This is not a personal failure. It is a predictable outcome of a life shaped by forces you were never asked to examine. Cultural conditioning plays its own silent role in all of this. From childhood, most of us were immersed in a narrative that equated simplicity with failure. The person who wants less was quietly framed as someone who couldn't compete, couldn't aspire, couldn't dream big enough. Ambition was always directional, outward, upward, more. The idea that one might deliberately subtract from a life as an act of profound intelligence was not offered as an option. It was at best an eccentricity, at worst a kind of surrender. And so, the consequences compound invisibly. The fractured attention, the identity built on sand, the chronic low-grade anxiety of a life performing itself for an audience that is also performing. The loss of genuine presence, genuine connection, genuine thought. The creeping suspicion, never quite spoken aloud, that you have been extraordinarily busy becoming someone you never actually chose to be. Aldous Huxley, in his haunting vision of a future built on pleasure and distraction rather than force and fear, suggested that the most effective form of control is the kind that feels like freedom. The kind where the cage is so comfortable, so entertaining, so constantly stimulating that the captive never thinks to question the bars. You are not powerless in this, but you cannot find your way out of a trap you haven't fully seen. And now, finally, you have seen it, which means what comes next is no longer a philosophy, it is a choice. A radical, countercultural, deeply personal choice that some of the most quietly powerful human beings in history have made before you. The question is whether you are ready to make it too.
Every so often in history, someone refuses. Not loudly, not with a manifesto nailed to a cathedral door or a revolution fought in the streets, but quietly, deliberately, with the kind of calm that is somehow more radical than rage. Someone simply stops. They look at the current everyone else is swimming in, feel its pull on their limbs, and make a decision so simple it borders on scandalous. I am going to stop pretending this current is taking me somewhere I want to go. This is what Thoreau did on the morning of July 4th, 1845, Independence Day, chosen with full intention, when he walked into the woods at Walden Pond and began building a life from scratch. Not because he was broken, not because he had failed at the conventional life, but because he was lucid enough to see that the conventional life, accepted without examination, was itself a kind of failure. A failure of awareness, a failure of nerve, a failure to ask the one question that every human being deserves to ask at least once with complete honesty. Is this life actually mine? That question is the beginning of the rebellion, and it is far more dangerous than it sounds. Because the moment you ask it sincerely, the moment you hold it still long enough to feel its full weight, everything built on unexamined assumption begins to tremble. The career chosen for approval rather than meaning, the lifestyle inflated to impress people you don't particularly admire, the relentless forward motion mistaken for purpose, the busyness worn like armor against the terrifying stillness in which you might finally have to meet yourself. The rebellion Thoreau invites is not against society, it is against unconsciousness, and its most powerful weapon is not anger, it is simplicity.
Here is the counterintuitive truth that changes everything. Freedom is not found in expanding your options. It is found in clarifying your values. The person with 10,000 choices and no clear sense of what genuinely matters to them is not free. They are paralyzed, perpetually reactive, forever at the mercy of whatever the loudest voice in the room is currently demanding. But the person who has done the quiet, uncomfortable work of knowing what they actually need, what nourishes rather than merely stimulates, what builds rather than merely entertains, what aligns with the person they are becoming rather than the image they have been performing, that person moves through the world with a kind of grounded authority that no amount of accumulation can manufacture. The Stoics understood this with mathematical precision. Epictetus, born into slavery and yet one of the most psychologically free human beings who ever lived, taught that the path to freedom runs directly through the elimination of unnecessary want, not through suppression or denial, but through the disciplined, practiced art of knowing what is genuinely yours to care about and releasing everything else with complete indifference. What he described was not poverty of spirit, it was sovereignty of attention. And sovereignty of attention, in a world hell-bent on stealing it, is the most radical act available to you. Abraham Maslow, studying the small percentage of human beings he identified as truly self-actualized, people living from their deepest nature rather than their most anxious compensations, found something initially surprising him. These individuals were not, by conventional measures, the most impressive. They did not have the most. They were not the most decorated or the most celebrated. What they shared was something quieter and far more powerful: simplicity of taste, richness of inner life, and an almost serene indifference to the opinions of people who did not know them deeply. They had, in essence, done exactly what Thoreau advocated. They had stripped away the noise until only the signal remained, and then they had built their lives around that signal with absolute fidelity. This is not a personality type, it is a practice, and it begins not with a dramatic gesture, but with a single, honest question asked about each area of your life. Does this serve who I am becoming, or does it serve the performance I have been maintaining? Start with your attention. Notice without judgment where it goes in an unguarded moment, what you reach for when you are anxious, what you consume when you are empty, what you fill silence with when silence begins to feel too much. These patterns are not character flaws, they are maps. They show you precisely where the noise has taken root and therefore exactly where the work of simplification needs to begin. Then move to your time, that most democratic and most squandered of all resources. Thoreau's great discovery at Walden was that the simple life was not comfortable. It was that a life stripped of unnecessary obligation returned to him something he had not realized he was missing: hours. Long, unscheduled, unhurried hours in which genuine thought was possible, in which observation deepened into insight, in which the self, freed from the constant pressure of performance, could begin to reveal its actual contours. Consider what you might discover in that kind of space. Not the curated self that shows up for an audience, but the unguarded, unpolished, genuinely curious self that exists underneath all the striving. The self that finds meaning in a shaft of afternoon light through a window, that thinks its best thoughts in motion, that knows in its quiet depths exactly what it values, and has simply never been given enough silence to hear that knowledge clearly. This is where the rebellion becomes personal, because breaking free from complexity is not ultimately about minimalism as an aesthetic or simplicity as a trend. It is about reclaiming the conditions under which you specifically can think most clearly, feel most fully, and act most authentically. It is about designing your inner world with the same intentionality that the systems profiting from your distraction have designed their platforms, except in your favor,
for your flourishing, in service of the life you actually want to live. History is full of people who made this choice and were transformed by it. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of the most powerful empire on earth, wrote his deepest philosophy in a private journal never intended for publication, a daily practice of stripping his mind back to essentials, of reminding himself what actually mattered beneath the weight of empire and expectation. Gandhi, who moved the conscience of a nation, owned almost nothing and needed almost nothing, and derived from that needlessness a freedom so complete that no external power could diminish it. Thoreau himself, in 2 years and 2 months at Walden Pond, produced a body of insight that has outlasted virtually every achievement of his conventionally ambitious contemporaries. These were not people who gave up. They were people who finally, clearly saw what was worth picking up. And here is what they all discovered, what you are on the edge of discovering right now if you're willing to stay with this long enough to let it land completely. The life waiting for you on the other side of simplicity is not smaller than the one you have now. It is truer. And truth, once tasted, makes every comfortable illusion feel like exactly what it always was, a very elaborate, very exhausting, very unnecessary way of being afraid. You are not afraid anymore. You are awake. And what comes next, the final and most profound realization of this entire journey, is the one that will make everything that came before it suddenly, irreversibly clear.
There is a moment, and perhaps you have felt it, briefly, in the spaces between the noise, where everything goes quiet in exactly the right way. Not the quiet of emptiness, not the quiet of giving up, but the quiet of arrival, the rare, almost startling sensation of being precisely where you are, without apology, without agenda, without the low hum of everything you haven't yet become, drowning out everything you already are. A moment so unguarded and so complete that time, for just an instant, stops performing itself and simply is. Thoreau lived inside that moment, not as an accident, not as a gift, but as a deliberate and daily practice, the hard-won result of stripping his life down to its irreducible core until what remained was not less than a full life, but more than he had ever known a life could be. And here, at the end of this journey, is the truth he found there, the final realization, the one so simple it hides in plain sight, and so powerful that once you genuinely receive it, the architecture of everything you thought you were working toward begins to quietly, permanently rearrange itself. You do not need to earn your right to exist. Read that again, slowly. Let it move through you the way light moves through water, refracting, reaching into depths you forgot were there. You do not need to justify your presence on this earth through accumulation. You do not need to outproduce, outachieve, outdisplay, or outperform your way into worthiness. You do not need to become a more impressive version of yourself before you are allowed to feel the full weight of being alive. You are already here. You are already enough of a miracle to deserve your own complete attention. And the life available to you, right now, in this breath, in this ordinary and extraordinary moment, is not a waiting room for the life you will deserve once you have finally done enough. It is the life itself. This is what Thoreau understood with a clarity that bordered on the sacred, that most human suffering is not inflicted by circumstance, but manufactured by distance, the distance between where we are and the story we carry about where we should be, between who we are and the performance we have mistaken for identity, between the life we are actually living and the life we are too distracted, too afraid, too relentlessly busy to notice we are living. A simple life collapses that distance, not by lowering ambition, but by relocating it,
from the exhausting pursuit of external validation to the quiet, sustaining practice of inner alignment, from the question, how much can I accumulate, to the far more intelligent question, how deeply can I live? Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying the conditions under which human beings experience what he called flow, that state of complete, effortless engagement where self-consciousness dissolves, time restructures itself, and meaning emerges not as a concept but as a felt reality. What he found was both simple and profound. Flow does not arise from abundance. It does not arise from complexity, stimulation, or the feverish accumulation of experience. It arises from clarity, from the alignment of attention, skill, and purpose in a space uncluttered enough for full engagement to take root. Thoreau's entire life at Walden was an extended experiment in creating exactly those conditions. Every unnecessary obligation refused was an act of preservation, not of comfort, but of capacity. Every hour reclaimed from performance was an hour returned to presence. Every layer of complexity stripped away revealed not emptiness beneath, but bedrock, the solid, unhurried, genuinely nourishing substance of a life in direct contact with itself. And this is where the rebellion of simplicity reveals its final and most subversive dimension. A person who knows what is enough cannot be controlled. Think about that with its full implication. The entire architecture of modern manufactured desire, the advertising, the algorithm, the carefully engineered anxiety of comparison and inadequacy, depends on one thing above all else: your belief that you are not yet sufficient, that the gap between who you are and who you need to become is real, urgent, and closable only through consumption. The moment you dissolve that belief, not by suppressing desire, but by cultivating a relationship with sufficiency so honest and so deep that artificial want simply loses its grip, you become, in the most profound sense, free. Not free in the abstract, free in the specific, practical, daily sense of waking up and moving through the world from a place of genuine choice rather than chronic anxiety. Free to say no to what diminishes you and yes to what enlarges you, not because a productivity system told you to, but because you have done the interior work of knowing the difference. Free to measure your days not by output or optics, but by the only currency that cannot be inflated, stolen, or algorithmically manipulated: depth of experience. Epictetus taught that the free person is not the one who has everything they want, but the one who wants nothing beyond what they have chosen to value. Thoreau lived this principle, not as philosophy, but as practice, in the frost of Walden mornings, in the discipline of his pencil and his axe, in the radical act of sitting still long enough to hear what his own life was actually telling him. What is your life telling you? Beneath the notifications and the obligations and the performance and the noise, what is the quiet signal that has been trying to reach you? What is the version of yourself that exists not as an aspiration or an image, but as a living, breathing, already present reality, waiting not to be constructed, but simply to be uncovered? Because here is the final truth that Thoreau's entire life points toward: the realization that makes every sacrifice of complexity feel not like loss, but like liberation. Simplicity is not the end of the journey. It is the moment the journey becomes real. Everything before simplicity is preparation, necessary perhaps, but ultimately preliminary. The accumulation that teaches you what accumulation cannot provide, the complexity that reveals, through exhaustion, the intelligence of restraint, the noise that makes the silence, when you finally choose it, feel not like absence, but like homecoming. When you strip your life to its essentials, not in deprivation, but in discernment, what remains is not a smaller life, it is an honest one, a life in which your time belongs to your values, your attention belongs to your experience, and your identity belongs to no one but you.
a life in which presence is not an achievement to be unlocked, but the natural condition of a mind no longer at war with itself. Thoreau did not go to Walden to find peace. He went to stop doing the things that were destroying it. That distinction contains everything. You do not need to move to the woods. You do not need to own nothing, schedule nothing, want nothing. What you need, the only thing you have ever needed, is the willingness to ask with genuine honesty and genuine courage which parts of your life are yours and which parts are noise, and then, quietly, without drama, without waiting for permission from a world that will never grant it, to begin living from the answer. Not someday, not when the conditions are perfect, not when you have finally become impressive enough to deserve stillness. Now. In this breath, in this ordinary, irreplaceable, never-to-be-repeated moment that is asking nothing of you except that you be fully, simply, and completely present within it. This is what Thoreau understood. This is what the intelligence of simplicity finally reveals. Not a technique, not a trend, not a philosophy for the privileged or the passive, but a truth as old and as urgent as the human soul itself. One that has been waiting, patiently and without judgment, beneath every layer of complexity you have ever accepted, for the moment you were ready to hear it. Life, met directly and without illusion, is enough. You, stripped of performance and returned to yourself, are enough. And the simple, deliberate, fully inhabited moment, this one, right here, is not a stepping stone to meaning. It is meaning itself.